oh, my brothers and sisters, and they, and z, zim, zer. I ask you, will California go the same direction as Canada to compel speech from you? Pronoun prison. California moves towards criminalizing the refusal to use the correct pronoun for transgender people. Constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley wants to discuss impending legislation that will not just restrict the use of words or language, but require you to expand your vocabulary to include invented gender pronouns. The California State Senate is considering a bill that would make it a crime to willfully and repeatedly refuse to use a transgender resident's preferred name or pronouns in a public health, retirement, or housing institution. State Senate Scott Wiener has introduced SB 219 with a variety of transgender protections, but the pronoun controversy is likely to get the most attention. Violators face a year in jail and a potential $1,000 fine. The criminalization of pronoun misuse, however, could raise serious free speech and other constitutional concerns. The bill imposes the limitations on long-term care facilities and staff, but critics believe that it will lay the foundation for a broader law to apply to public schools and other facilities. The law states in part,
except as provided in subdivision B, it shall be unlawful for a long-term care facility or facility staff to take any of the following actions wholly or partially on the basis of a person's actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, status. Where rooms are assigned by gender, assigning, reassigning, or refusing to assign a room to a transgender resident other than in accordance with the transgender resident's gender identity, unless at the transgender resident's request. Willfully and repeatedly fail to use a resident's preferred name or pronouns after being clearly informed of the preferred name or pronouns.
There remains a debate over the free speech rights of academics and others in refusing to use a wide array of new pronouns. As we have discussed previously, those who object have stated religious, political, and legal objections to the required use of pronouns like they for single individuals, or z or m or Given this relatively new debate, the question is why the state should criminalize pronoun abuse. Good points, Jonathan. In Canada, with Bill C-16, we have been warned by Professors Jordan Peterson and Gad Saad how laws like this can diminish our rights to free speech. Others have denounced the slippery slope argument as pure fabrication, but instead tell us that this law has nothing to do with protected speech. In the Globe and Mail, they tell us, Bill C-16 became the focus of controversy, with opponents lining up behind claims that the law would violate freedom of expression. Legally and factually dubious claims about the law became the platform to oppose equality for trans and non-binary Canadians, cloaking the underlying transphobia that animated the opposition. It would be a serious mistake to label anyone opposed to this type of legislation as transphobic. In the modern civilized West, most people embrace inclusion and simple courtesy, although now panned by feminists as patriarchal bullying. Opening the door for complete strangers in public has become the norm. Most of us will go out of our way to accommodate someone's wishes. Elizabeth wants to be known and addressed as Liz or Beth, and we automatically comply. There is no need to use the force of law to compel us to treat others with kindness. But I want to get back to this widely debunked slippery slope argument. I think these words pretty much sum up the intended use or misuse of Canada's new law.
I've spent 20 plus years working at the nexus of evolutionary psychology and the behavioral sciences, a central feature of which is to explore how evolutionary and biological principles shape our human nature. At the root of this grand objective is the profoundly obvious reality that humans are a sexually reproducing, sexually dimorphic species consisting of reproductively viable males and females. This in no way rejects the equally obvious fact that the rich human tapestry includes other personhoods, such as intersexed and transgendered individuals. Following a 2014 lecture that I delivered at Wellesley College on the thought police, I had a conversation with a student who argued passionately that professors should poll their students at the start of class about their gender identities. While most might have construed her position as outlandish back then, some now consider it too tame. Take the Office of BGLTQ Student Life at Harvard University, who recently distributed a flyer to combat transphobia, wherein it was stated that one's gender identity and gender expression could change daily, and that, quote, fixed binaries and biological essentialism constitute transphobic misinformation that is tantamount to systemic violence. Was the Wellesley student transphobic since she did not potentially consider the daily fluidity of one's gender identity? What about minute-to-minute changes? Should professors poll their students every 10th minute of every lecture to find out if their gender identities have changed since last asked? Should academics no longer design surveys wherein a participant's biological sex is measured as a binary variable? Would this be transphobic systemic violence since it perpetuates fixed binaries and biological essentialism? Facebook and New York City allow 50 plus and 31 genders respectively as part of one's profile. Should professors develop surveys that recognize all of these genders? Would it be systemically violent to not do so? Should evolutionists no longer explain how sexual selection works, namely the fundamental process by which sex differences evolve? This mechanism recognizes two sexes, and hence it might, quote, disenfranchise those who reject fixed binaries and biological essentialism. Bottom line, foundational tenets of evolution might be construed as legal transgressions under Bill C-16. So evolution itself might be a transgression.
A key problem with this bill is that it proposes to amend something as important as the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code in order to include something that isn't even definable. According to Justice Canada, gender identity is defined as a person's internal or individual experience of their gender. But this definition misunderstands what gender is. Gender is not about internal or individual experiences. It's a social construction. It exists as a means to reinforce stereotypes and oppressive ideas about men and women. Gender does not mean male or female, it means masculine or feminine. A century ago, gender determined that women should not be allowed to vote or be counted as persons under the law in Canada. Gender says that men are inherently violent, aggressive, independent, assertive, and rational, whereas women are inherently passive, delicate, nurturing, irrational, and emotional. These ideas have been disproved thanks in large part to the feminist movement. Yet today, in creating and supporting the idea that one can have an internal gender identity, we are regressing. No one is born with a gender. We are born male or female, and gender is then imposed on us through socialization. Women do not know they are women because they are born interested in high heels or the color pink. They know they are women because they are female. Treating gender as though it is either internal or a personal choice is dangerous and completely misunderstands how and why women are oppressed under patriarchy as a class of people.
When I looked on the website, I thought, well, there's broader issues at stake here, and I tried to outline some of those broader issues in the initial, you may or may not know, I made some videos criticizing Bill C-16 and a number of the policies that surrounding it. And I think the most egregious elements of the policies are that it requires compelled speech. The Ontario Human Rights Commission explicitly states that refusing to refer to a person by their self-identified name and proper personal pronoun, which is the pronouns that I was objecting to, can be interpreted as harassment, and so that's explicitly defined in the relevant policies. So I think that's appalling. First of all, because there hasn't been a piece of legislation that requires Canadians to utter a particular form of address that has particular ideological implications before, and I think that it's a line that we shouldn't cross. Then I think that the definition of identity that's enshrined in the surrounding policies is ill-defined and poorly thought through and also incorrect. It's incorrect in that identity is not and will never be something that people define subjectively, because your identity is something that you actually have to act out in the world as a set of procedural tools, which most people learn, and I'm being technical about this, between the ages of 2 and 4. It's a fundamental human reality. It's well recognized by the relevant, say, developmental psychological authorities. And so the idea that identity is something that you define purely subjectively is an idea without status as far as I'm concerned. I also think it's unbelievably dangerous for us to move towards representing a social constructionist view of identity in our legal system. The social constructionist view insists that human identity is nothing but a consequence of socialization, and there's an inordinate amount of scientific evidence suggesting that that happens to not be the case. And so the reason that this is being instantiated into law is because the people who are promoting that sort of perspective, or at least in part because the people who are promoting that sort of perspective know perfectly well that they've lost the battle completely on scientific grounds. It's implicit in the policies of the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual identity, biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual proclivity all vary independently, and that's simply not the case. It's not the case scientifically, it's not the case factually, and it's certainly not something that should be increasingly taught to people in high schools, elementary schools, and junior high schools, which it is, and it is being taught.
This speaks for the intended purpose of Canada's new law.
So what about pronouns? A pronoun is a word that stands in for a name. Some common ones are he and she, but some non-binary people and other trans folk might use they or z or something else. So why does it matter? It's important to use the appropriate pronouns for trans people for a number of reasons. The first reason is that it's the law.
Please tell us your thoughts on this type of legislation in the comments below. If there is no open debate on this subject, some of our rights may just go gently into that good night.
Goodbye.